All right, so today we're going to be tackling Byron Katie's Loving What Is,
Oh, yeah.
which really seems to be about kind of taking those thoughts that we all have that cause us, stress and frustration and even anger, and sort of looking at them in a different way, in a way that can maybe lead us to some more peace in our lives.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what's so interesting about her approach is that she's not trying to change the events themselves. Because face it, we can't control a lot of what happens in our lives, but instead she's saying, let's change our thinking about the events.
Yeah, but I mean,
It's
I,
actually
I struggle with that a little bit. I'm a little skeptical.
okay.
I mean, can simply changing our thoughts actually change our lives? I mean, I get that our thoughts influence our emotions, but sometimes things just are bad,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, well, that's the kind of question she would want you to ask. Like, she doesn't want us to just blindly accept anything. And in fact, her whole method, which she calls the work, is all about inquiry. And, she starts the book with her own story. She wakes up in 1986 in a halfway house with a completely transformed worldview. And it wasn't a mystical retreat. It wasn't a sudden epiphany or anything like that. It was just this intense inner questioning that led her to realize her own thoughts weren't true.
Oh, that's pretty dramatic. So, was there anything in her background that hinted at this kind of radical shift in thinking?
Not really. She seems like she was just an ordinary woman who kind of stumbled upon this incredibly powerful way of looking at the world. And that's what's so compelling about it. If she can do it, it's like anyone can.
So, is this all just kind of new age self help stuff, or is there actual science behind it?
There is, believe it or not, her ideas actually align with a lot of really fascinating discoveries in neuroscience. So, you know how sometimes we get stuck in these negative thought loops that just spiral out of control? Well, neuroscientists have actually found that this is partly due to a specific part of our brain called the interpreter.
The interpreter, what does that do?
So think of it as the storyteller in your head. It's constantly trying to make sense of the world, weaving together a narrative based on your experiences and beliefs. But the problem is this interpreter isn't always accurate. It can actually fabricate stories that aren't true, leading to all sorts of emotional distress.
So, you're telling me my own brain is basically lying to me?
In a way, not intentionally, but yeah, it's like having an internal spin doctor who's maybe a little too good at their job, spinning everything to fit your existing beliefs, even if those beliefs are not serving you. And the work is designed to help us kind of question that spin doctor, see through those fabricated stories, and get to the truth.
Okay, I see how this could be helpful. But how do we actually do the work? It sounds pretty abstract.
It's actually very practical. It's a four-question process for examining our thoughts. So let's say you're dealing with a situation that's causing you a lot of stress. Maybe you're feeling resentful towards a coworker or anxious about an upcoming presentation.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. So, what's the first question?
The first question is it true? And I know it sounds deceptively simple, but really pause and ask yourself, is this thought that's causing me so much pain actually true?
Hmm. I never really stopped to question it. I just assume it's true because it feels so real in the moment.
Right, and that's where the power of inquiry comes in. By simply asking, is it true? You start to create some distance between yourself and the thought. You begin to see it as just a thought, not an absolute truth.
Okay, so what are the other three questions?
So the second question is, can you absolutely know that it's true? So this is really pushing you to examine the evidence for your belief. Is it based on facts or just your own assumptions and interpretations? And then the third question is, how do you react? What happens when you believe that thought? And this helps you to see the impact that the thought is having, on your emotions, your behavior, your relationships.
Uh huh.
And then finally, the fourth question is, who would you be without the thought? And this allows you to envision a more peaceful, more empowered version of yourself.
Wow. Those are some powerful questions. I can already see how just asking those could shift my perspective.
It's amazing how much we suffer unnecessarily just because we believe our thoughts without question.
Totally. But I have to admit, I'm still a little stuck on that first question. Sometimes it feels impossible to separate myself from my thoughts.
Oh.
They're so loud and insistent. So, how do you actually get to a place where you can honestly question them?
Well, she actually has a technique called proof of truth that can help
Yeah.
with that. And have you ever noticed that the more you try to suppress a thought, the stronger it seems to get?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
It's like the thought police in my head working overtime.
Exactly. So instead of trying to fight those thoughts, she suggests we actually lean into them. And so with proof of truth, you actually sit down and write down all the reasons why you believe that thought is true.
Why would I want to do that? It seems like that would just make it even more real.
Oh, here's the thing. When you bring those thoughts out into the open, when you see them written down in black and white, they often start to lose their power. You begin to see the flaws in your logic, the assumptions you're making, the ways in which you're distorting reality.
So it's like exposing the thought to the light of day, and it just kind of withers away.
Exactly. And that's when you can really start to question it. You're not just trying to suppress it anymore, you're actively engaging with it, examining it from all angles.
Okay. I'm definitely intrigued by this proof of truth technique.
Mm.
I have a feeling it could be really helpful for some of those stubborn thoughts that just won't quit.
It can be incredibly liberating, and once you've started to question the thought, that's when you can start to explore what she calls the turnarounds.
Ah, yes, the turnarounds. I've heard about those. They sound a little mind-bending.
They can be, but they're also incredibly powerful. So the idea is to take your stressful thought and turn it around to the self, the other, and the opposite. So let's say your thought is, my partner doesn't appreciate me.
Ouch. That's a tough one. So how would you turn that around?
Well, turning it around to the self would be, I don't appreciate myself. Turning it around to the other would be, I don't appreciate my partner. And the opposite would be, my partner does appreciate me.
Wow, those are very different perspectives. I could see how that could shift things.
Yeah, the goal isn't to find the right turnaround, but to just explore all the possibilities, see the situation from different angles. And this can help you break free from the limited perspective of your original thought and open up to new ways of understanding the situation.
Okay, that's starting to make sense, but I have to be honest. I'm still a little skeptical about whether simply changing my thoughts can really change my life. It seems like sometimes you need to take action to actually change your circumstances.
That's a great point, and she acknowledges that, action is sometimes necessary, but she also emphasizes that our actions are always driven by our thoughts. So if you want to change your behavior, you first need to change your thinking.
So it's like the work gives you the clarity and the motivation to take effective action, rather than just reacting from a place of fear or anger.
Exactly, and sometimes the most powerful action you can take is to simply let go of a thought that's no longer serving you.
It sounds like the work is less about forcing ourselves to be positive and more about just being open to seeing things differently.
That's a great way to put it. It's about cultivating a sense of curiosity and questioning, rather than getting stuck in these rigid beliefs.
Okay, I'm starting to get really excited about this, but I'm also wondering, is the work just for personal problems, or can it be applied to bigger issues, like the stuff we see happening in the world?
That's actually one of the most fascinating things about her work. She shows how these same principles can be applied to everything from, relationship conflicts to global issues like war and terrorism.
Wait, really? How can changing my thoughts about war actually make a difference?
Well, it's not about denying the reality of war or pretending that it doesn't exist. It's about recognizing that our own thoughts and beliefs about war are often what cause us the most suffering.
I'm not sure I understand. Can you give me an example?
Sure. So let's say you're feeling overwhelmed by the news of a conflict happening somewhere in the world. You might be thinking, this is terrible. It shouldn't be happening. Someone needs to do something.
Yeah, I definitely have those thoughts all the time.
Right. And those thoughts might seem justified, even noble, but they're also creating a lot of inner turmoil. So Katie would invite you to ask, is it true that war shouldn't be happening?
I guess it depends on your perspective. I mean, from a humanitarian standpoint, yes, war is terrible. But from a historical perspective, conflict has always been a part of human existence.
Exactly. By questioning that thought, you start to see the complexity of the issue. You recognize that you can't control what's happening on the other side of the world, but you can control your own thoughts and reactions.
So it's about finding a sense of peace within yourself, even in the midst of chaos.
Precisely. And that inner peace can actually be a powerful catalyst for positive change. When you're not consumed by fear and anger, you're more likely to respond to the situation in a skillful and compassionate way.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could apply to all sorts of issues, not just personal problems. This is really opening up a whole new way of looking at the world. But before we get too carried away with global issues, I'm curious to hear more about how the work can be used in everyday relationships.
Sure. So she has this great example in the book about a woman named Mary who's feeling resentful towards her husband, Paul. And she believes that Paul doesn't listen to me.
Right.
And this belief is causing her a lot of pain and frustration.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Communication problems are a major source of stress in relationships.
Absolutely. So Katie would encourage Mary to take that thought, Paul doesn't listen to me, and run it through the 4 questions.
Okay, so the first question is it true? But how can Mary know for sure if it's true that Paul doesn't listen to her? Maybe he's just distracted, or maybe she's not communicating her needs clearly.
That's exactly the kind of inquiry that she encourages. She's not saying that Paul is definitely listening or that Mary is definitely wrong. She's simply inviting Mary to question her own perception of the situation.
I see. So it's not about blaming Paul or even trying to change his behavior. It's about Mary taking responsibility for her own thoughts and feelings.
Exactly. And that's where the real power of the work lies. When you shift your focus from trying to change others to understanding yourself, you open up to a whole new level of freedom and empowerment.
This is all starting to make a lot of sense. But I have to admit, I'm still a little bit intimidated by the idea of questioning all my thoughts. It seems like it could be really destabilizing, like shaking the foundation of my whole reality.
Yeah, it can be challenging for sure, but it can also be incredibly liberating. Remember, she's not saying that you have to let go of all your beliefs. She's simply inviting you to question them, to see if they're really serving you. And if they're not, you have the power to choose different thoughts that create more peace and happiness in your life.
I'm starting to get really excited about this. I have a feeling this deep dive is going to be a wild ride.
It definitely will be. And I think you're going to be amazed by how much you can transform your life simply by changing your thoughts.
So we talked about the 4 questions and the power of inquiry, but I'm still a little fuzzy on how this actually translates to a more peaceful life. Like, it feels like there's this gap between intellectually understanding these concepts and actually feeling the effects.
Yeah, you've hit on something really important there. It's not just about head knowledge. It's about a shift in how we experience reality. And she uses this great analogy of a carpenter's level to kind of illustrate this point.
Okay, a carpenter's level. I'm intrigued. How does that tie into the work?
So imagine, holding that level up against a surface, and when the bubble is off center, it means we're out of alignment. Our thoughts are saying, this shouldn't be happening, this is wrong. We're resisting reality, but when that bubble is centered, that's when our thoughts are aligned with what is, we acknowledge this is what's happening without all the mental struggle.
So it's not about liking everything that happens. It's about dropping that inner resistance.
Exactly. It's like when you're stuck in traffic, you can fume and rage and wish it were different, but the traffic jam remains. The work helps us kind of accept that reality, the traffic, and then choose how to respond skillfully. Maybe you put on a podcast or call a friend or use the time to plan your day.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But isn't there a danger of becoming passive if we just accept everything? What about situations where we actually need to take action to change things?
Right. It's not about becoming a doormat. She's very clear about that. The work is not about condoning bad behavior or resigning yourself to a bad situation. It's about recognizing, what you can control and what you can't control. You can't control the traffic, but you can control your reaction to it. And once you've accepted the reality of the situation, you're actually in a much better position to take effective action if it's needed.
That's a really important distinction. So it's about choosing our response rather than just reacting impulsively.
That's the heart of it, yeah. Moving from a place of reactivity to a place of responsiveness, and that shift can be profoundly empowering.
It just occurred to me that there's a parallel here with mindfulness. Like both mindfulness and the work seem to be about cultivating a greater awareness of our thoughts and feelings.
That's a great observation. There's definitely an overlap there. Mindfulness is about paying attention to the present moment without judgment, and the work kind of takes it a step further by inviting us to actually question those judgments to see if they're really based in reality.
So it's like the work adds a layer of critical thinking to mindfulness practice.
Exactly. It's about cultivating that curious, questioning mind. And she talks about how inquiry actually became like an automatic response for her, like a wordless questioning that met every thought. It's like developing a built-in truth detector.
That's amazing.
Uh-huh.
I can only imagine how liberating it would feel to have that kind of mental clarity. But I'm curious, once you've gone through the 4 questions and explored the turnarounds, what's next? Is that the end of the work?
Well, she suggests a practice called reporting. And this involves sharing your realizations with someone else, ideally in the presence of at least 2 witnesses.
Interesting. Why is it important to share these insights with others?
It's not about gossiping or blaming, but it's about really owning your part in a situation and hearing it reflected back to you. And when you speak your truth out loud, it becomes more real, more solidified. And it can also help you to see things from a new perspective, especially if your witnesses offer their own insights.
It sounds like it could be a powerful way to kind of integrate these insights into your life, to move them from your head to your heart, so to speak.
Exactly. And it also reinforces the importance of taking responsibility, which is another key theme in the book.
That makes sense. When we share our realizations with others, we're acknowledging that we're not victims of our circumstances, but active participants in creating our own reality.
Absolutely. Taking responsibility can be scary, but it's also incredibly empowering. It frees us from that victim mentality and allows us to respond to situations with greater clarity and agency.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. The inquiry, the turnarounds, the reporting. It's all about taking ownership of our thoughts and choices and
Hmm.
ultimately creating a more peaceful and fulfilling life. But what about making amends? I have to admit, I've always struggled with that concept. It feels a bit like forced forgiveness.
Yeah, that's a common misconception. Living amends, as she calls it, isn't about apologizing out of guilt or trying to manipulate others into forgiving you. It's about acting with integrity. It's about aligning your actions with your newfound understanding.
So it's less about saying, I'm sorry, and more about changing your behavior.
Exactly. It's about taking actions that undo past harms and create a more peaceful present, both for yourself and for others.
That reminds me of the story about her husband, who secretly gives money to children who seem short on cash. It's such a beautiful illustration of how amends can be woven into everyday life.
It's a perfect example of how this work can manifest in practical, often unexpected ways. It's not just about intellectual understanding, it's about embodying that understanding in the way we live and interact with the world.
Okay, I'm really starting to grasp the depth of this work.
Hmm.
It's not just about fixing problems or feeling better. It's about like a fundamental shift in how we relate to ourselves and the world around us.
That's it, exactly. And what's so inspiring is that she shows how this approach can be applied to such a wide range of challenges, from personal relationships to global issues.
Yeah, we talked a bit about applying the work to war and terrorism, but I'm curious to hear more about how it can be used in everyday situations like work conflicts or financial anxieties.
Great question. She actually shares a lot of examples in the book of people using the work to navigate those types of challenges. For instance, there's a story about Gary who was constantly frustrated with a colleague that he perceived as incompetent.
Ooh, I think we've all been there at some point, that feeling of, why can't they just get it together?
Right, and he was really stuck in that thought. Frank should step up to the plate as an expert. He felt it was Frank's responsibility to change.
So how did Gary apply the work to this situation? Did he just tell himself that Frank was actually competent? That seems a bit far-fetched.
He didn't try to force himself to believe something that wasn't true. Instead, he used the four questions to really examine that thought. Is it true that Frank should step up to the plate as an expert? Can I absolutely know that it's true? And so on.
And what happened when he questioned those thoughts? Did he have some sort of epiphany where he suddenly saw Frank as this brilliant colleague?
It wasn't about suddenly seeing Frank differently. It was about understanding where his own frustration was coming from. And through the work, he realized that his frustration stemmed from his own beliefs about how Frank should be, rather than accepting Frank as he was.
So it was less about changing Frank and more about changing Gary's expectations of Frank.
Exactly. And once he let go of that need to control Frank, he was able to focus on what he could control his own actions and reactions. So instead of trying to force Frank to change, he started focusing on clearly communicating his needs and offering support where he could.
That's a great example of how the work can shift our focus from trying to change others to changing ourselves.
Mhm.
It's so easy to get caught up in that blame game, but ultimately, the only person we can truly control is ourselves.
Absolutely. And that realization can be incredibly liberating. It allows us to take responsibility for our own happiness and well-being rather than making it dependent on others.
Okay, I'm really starting to see the practical applications of this. It's not just some abstract philosophy. It's a tool we can use to navigate the challenges of everyday life. Do you have any other examples of how the work has helped people in real-life situations?
Sure, another great example from the book is Marty, who was dealing with a lot of financial anxiety. He had made a bad investment and was feeling resentful towards his uncle who had refused to bail him out.
Oof. Financial stress can be so overwhelming, it's easy to see how that could lead to resentment and blame.
Absolutely. And he was trapped in this thought, my uncle should bail me out of financial ruin.
Yeah.
He believed it was his uncle's responsibility to fix the situation.
It sounds like he was stuck in a victim mentality, feeling powerless to change his circumstances.
Exactly. But through the work, he was able to see that his suffering stemmed from that belief, from placing the responsibility outside of himself. And he started to ask himself, is it really true that my uncle should bail me out? Can I absolutely know that it's true?
And those questions helped him too.
To see the situation more clearly, he realized that he was the one who made the investment and ultimately it was his responsibility to find a solution. So instead of being consumed by resentment, he was empowered to take action and regain control of his finances.
It's amazing how a simple shift in perspective can have such a profound impact on our experience. It's not about denying the reality of the situation. It's about choosing how we respond to it.
That's the key takeaway here. The work isn't a magic bullet that will instantly solve all our problems. It's a process of inquiry and self-discovery that empowers us to take responsibility for our own thoughts, feelings, and actions. And through that process, we can create more peace, happiness, and fulfillment in our lives.
Okay, I'm really starting to get fired up about this. It's not just about feeling better. It's about becoming more empowered, more resilient, more capable of navigating the challenges of life.
You've got it. It's about moving from a place of reactivity and blame to a place of responsibility and choice. And that's a journey worth taking, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I'm starting to see Loving What Is not just as a self-help book, but as a guide to living a more conscious and empowered life. It's interesting how Katie, she doesn't shy away from the really tough stuff in this book.
Right.
She tackles things like, body image addiction, even global conflicts like war and terrorism. It's like no topic is off limits when it comes to the work.
Yeah, that's what makes her approach so powerful and so versatile. She demonstrates that these principles can be applied to any situation, no matter how challenging or complex. Like, take Emily, for example, who was struggling with intense anxiety about terrorism in New York City. She was constantly on edge, terrified of taking the subway, furious with her family for not sharing her fears.
It sounds like she was trapped in this cycle of fear and anger, trying to control the uncontrollable. I can only imagine how exhausting that must have been,
Yeah.
For her and for her family.
Absolutely. And her thought, a terrorist can kill me on the subway, was fueling this anxiety, and it felt so real and so urgent that it was hard to see beyond it. But through the work, she was able to turn that thought around to see it from different perspectives.
Okay, so how do you turn around a thought like that? I mean, it seems almost impossible to find a positive spin on something so terrifying.
It's not about finding a positive spin. It's about questioning the validity of the thought. And one of the turnarounds she explored was, I can kill myself on the subway.
Whoa, that's a pretty intense turnaround.
Yeah.
How did that help her?
Well, it wasn't about minimizing the dangers of the subway. It was about recognizing that her own fear was the real source of her suffering. And by acknowledging the potential for danger in any situation, even something as mundane as taking the subway, she was able to release some of the grip that fear had on her.
That's a powerful realization. It's not about denying the existence of danger, but about understanding that our thoughts about danger can be just as harmful as the danger itself.
Exactly. And, she also encourages us to apply the work to even bigger, more abstract concepts like war itself. There's a story in the book about a man named Willem who, as a child, was caught in a bombing raid, and he carried this belief there should be no war for many years.
That's a sentiment I think a lot of people share. But how can you apply the work to something so vast and complex as war?
Right. And Willem, realized that while the sentiment was understandable, his inner conflict, his resistance to the reality of war was causing him immense suffering. And he couldn't single-handedly stop all wars, but he could work on his own inner peace, becoming an example of peace in the world.
That's a beautiful reminder that change starts from within. We can't always control external events, but we can control our own responses. And sometimes the most powerful form of activism is cultivating inner peace.
Right. And that inner peace can then ripple outwards, inspiring others and creating a more harmonious world.
Okay, so we've talked about war, terrorism, anxieties about everyday life. Are there any other areas where the work can be particularly helpful?
Well, the book also dives into topics like body image and addiction, which are often rooted in, deep-seated shame and self-judgment. And she emphasizes that it's not the body or the substance itself that's the problem, it's our thoughts about it.
Yeah, this really resonates with me on a personal level. I think it's so easy to get caught up in, negative self-talk about our bodies, to compare ourselves to others, and to believe those thoughts are true without ever questioning them.
Right. She shares her own experience with smoking in the book. She was a heavy smoker for years, but quit effortlessly after applying the work to her thoughts about smoking. And she realized, there's no addiction to the object itself, only attachment to a thought. And when those thoughts are investigated, their hold over us can loosen. So it's about shifting our focus from trying to control the external, the substance or the behavior, to understanding and transforming our internal relationship to it. It's like taking back your power from those addictive thoughts.
Exactly. And this applies to body image as well.
Yeah.
We can challenge those thoughts that tell us our bodies are not good enough, to recognize that those thoughts are just thoughts, not objective truths.
It's a call to reclaim our power, to choose self-acceptance over self-criticism, to see the beauty and strength in our bodies regardless of, shape or size.
And Loving What Is, goes even further, tackling, the ultimate challenge, death. And she encourages us to question, our fear of death, our resistance to its inevitability.
Okay, this is where I get a little squeamish. Death is a pretty heavy topic. How does she approach it?
Well, she uses this analogy of sleep. We don't fear falling asleep each night, even though it's a form of letting go, of surrendering to the unknown. And she suggests that death is similar, a natural process that we resist because of our thoughts and fears about it. That's a comforting perspective.
Yes.
It's a reminder that we can choose peace over fear, even in the face of the unknown.
Right. Ultimately, loving what is offers this profound invitation to examine our thoughts, to question those beliefs that cause us suffering, and to discover the freedom that comes from aligning ourselves with reality. And it's not always easy, but it's a journey worth taking.
I couldn't agree more, and as Katie reminds us, reality is always kinder than the stories we tell about it.